Hey everyone, Tactics here, and today I'll be giving you guys an early look at the raid coming with patch 10.2, Amirdrassil, The Dream's Hope. I'll give you guys a brief rundown here on the bosses, some thoughts on how they're looking, and how the raid itself is looking. This isn't going to be like an in-depth guide video or anything like that, but do note those will be coming once the patch actually does drop, so be on the lookout for those, both for raid and Mythic Plus. Now, in terms of what kind of testing has been done so far on the PTR, as with previous patches, the final boss of the raid is not being tested whatsoever, so we don't really have info outside of just the dungeon journal on Farak himself, but the other 8 bosses of the raid have all been tested on normal difficulty, and 7 of those same bosses have also been tested on heroic, with mythic testing scheduled to start later this week, which if you do want to check out, stop by my Twitch channel at Tactics on Thursdays and Fridays is usually when the raid testing is, and I do all those tests from a tank POV, so feel free to drop by, and that's what I'm going to be showing you guys here, my Twitch clips from that testing. So to start, I do actually want to do quickly, let's go through kind of like how the raid is looking. We've got this little graphic here. I believe this is from the Honolulu Guild Twitter, so shout out those guys, appreciate the little graphic here. Basically, this is another 9 boss raid here. You've got 2 bosses right off the top, but notably actually the second boss gives tier, potentially an adjustment because they've reduced the vault requirements on the first and the second step, so you only need 2 bosses now for your first stage in the vault, so you can get your vault here from the first tier boss, and then it splits up into like the fire wing and the emerald dream wing, where you have a couple fire bosses there, a couple emerald dream bosses there, and then it goes 3 bosses back to back to back at the end there. Kind of a little swapped up, I guess, if you take like Magmarax, basically, if you look at Aberrus and you put Magmarax as the second boss, that's kind of the format of this new raid. You just have 1 extra boss after the first boss that you have to do before the split actually happens, and you have 1 less boss later on in the raid. Now, I'm just going to go kind of boss by boss here. So we're going to start out with the very first boss of the raid, Mr. Tree Boy here, Gnarlroot, and I'll just kind of play what's going on here. I think this boss stacks up pretty nicely with other first bosses of the expansion so far. So Aranog and Kazara, you've got kind of there's raid damage going out, there's swirlies, the tank busters. It's pretty boring. It's basically a little barrage here you're going to see pop up. Putting stuff on bars. There's going to be like a bunch of hits on 1 tank, and then you just swap basically. It's 5 hits. Each hit will deal more damage over time, so you want the cooldown. You're going to have a cooldown covering all 5, but it's whatever. You got swirlies. There's a bunch of ads. You do some big AoE on this fight. The intermission is a little cool as well. Let's kind of fast forward there a little bit to the intermission. He runs to the middle, he spawns these roots, and on like heroic you'll get these soaks, and you touch these roots to light them on fire, and then there's like a damage amp once you've actually broken the boss free. On normal you just get it the debuff automatically, so we're lighting all the roots on fire, and then you fight the boss. He gets a big damage amp, he's like paralyzed, there's a bunch of ticking damage. So I think it's a pretty decent first boss as first bosses go. I'm pretty happy with it, and I think it looks pretty nice, especially compared to like how Aranog and Kazara went. Definitely better if you look at like Vigilant Guardian from before, from last expansion. It's definitely better than that, so pretty happy with this first boss here. Next up, we've got Igira here. Looks very much like Rashok here. In terms of, tank stuff, this she has like a melee that kind of functions like Sludge Fist, where it's going to be constantly cleaving on the tanks. So tanks want to be stacked at all times, Sludge Fist, Butcher, whatever you want to call it. And this fight is pretty interesting. It's mostly single target. You're going to see these spears come out, and you need to kill these, so you get a little bit of cleave. And we've experimented also with stacking them sometimes, depending on damage intake, but you're going to get to cleave those down. And then basically in the intermission, you kind of get to pick the phases of the fight, because you can see here there's like 3 little weapons or dead allies around the room, and when the intermission happens, you'll basically see we get to kind of soak one of these, and that picks the next phase of the boss. So that's kind of interesting. And on Mythic, it actually, you soak the one you don't want it, and the boss gets 2 weapons. It's kind of cool. So basically, as you can see, the soaks come out, we soak this, bunch of swirlies, and then, we go back and the boss picks this weapon because we soaked it. And in terms of like the different abilities, there's like, a big AoE soak that like stuns people. The stun is a magic debuff though, so you can like remove it, a mass dispel it, that kind of thing. You've got one where he like leaps and shoots waves everywhere, and you've got one that's like a healing absorb with like orbs that you have to dodge, that kind of thing. So pretty interesting. You're gonna pick the order, and the boss gets like a damage increase every time that intermission happens. So maybe you want to pick like the more difficult phases to happen early when there's less of a damage amp, that kind of thing. So little bit of decision making here on the second boss, and I actually think might be the best second boss of the expansion. I guess you're kind of comparing it to Primal Council in the first raid, as well as Assault, I guess, in the second raid. Two not great bosses, so definitely I think it's going to be a banger of a fight. So I'm excited for that. This is what happens when they get stunned and get dispelled. So notably it's magic stun. But yeah, I think it's a cool boss fight. I'm looking forward to this one for sure. Next up, though, we do have the Council boss. So this one, again, potentially third or fourth boss. This is the first boss of the Emerald Dream Wing here. So you can choose this one or the first boss in the Fire Wing next. Basically 3 bosses here, as you can see. Only one of them, Urktos, is the one actually getting tanked here, and the other 2 just kind of jump around randomly. There is a little bit of like shenanigans you can do to kind of slightly move them when they're casting, but it's kind of annoying. So one downside there. So it's essentially a 2-target cleave, and maybe like you could multi-dot the third guy, and you just kind of bring the bear around to whoever you want to cleave. That charge there is kind of interesting. So basically the abilities of the bosses kind of interact with each other a little bit. So for example, the Urktos bear here is going to hit full energy. He's going to start rampaging, and to interrupt that, you need to turn him into a duck. And you can see here we have players as ducks, going around. When you get turned into a duck, you want to eat some grass, and then you can leave duck form after you eat a few of them. But to turn this guy into it, you want to hit him when you with one of those duck AoEs, and that'll turn him into a giant duck while he's doing this ultimate ability. So that's kind of funny. It'll happen in a second here. Turn him into a duck during the rage. Otherwise, you're taking like big party damage during this phase here. Where's the duck? There it is. Big duck. Other interactions, I think, like when Erwin, the caster, does her ultimate, you like charge Urktos at her. And that's kind of how you stop that. I think Pips is just like this debuff you get, and you have to take damage from these green puddles to break that debuff, otherwise you die. So some interesting little interactions here between the bosses. So this kind of feel almost one tankable though, but I assume it's going to get amped up maybe a little bit, or maybe they'll make another boss tankable or something like that. But it did feel a little lacking from a tank's perspective. As you see there, like the debuff like falls off by the time a charge comes out. You only ever take 2 stacks of this tank debuff because there's such a large gap between them. So, we'll see if they do any changes for tanks, but otherwise it's just kind of an okay fight. I wasn't the biggest fan. Maybe one of my least favorite fights in the entire raid so far, honestly, but it's not even that bad either. So, I think it's an okay fight. Maybe, multi-daughters are going to be happier than, say, Melee, who don't get to hit all 3 bosses at once most of the time, unless some shenanigans happen, right? So, we'll see how this one actually shapes up. I actually don't remember what the mythic mechanics are for this one either, so I guess we'll see in testing there. But let's go to the boss after these guys in the same wing, Nymue. As you can see here, this room looks pretty cool, actually. These green lines are very relevant. They're not just like nice things on the ground. Whenever you cross one, it gives you a stacking 5-second dot. So if you chain cross a bunch of lines for any of the mechanics, you'll get this pretty nasty dot stacking up. And the pattern of these green lines does change throughout the fight, so you kind of have to constantly be aware of where they are. You can cross them. You see here these player-baited swirlies will come down, they'll become green, and that lets you cross these lines safely. But otherwise, for certain mechanics, you just kind of have to run over them maybe and get a stack, maybe 2, trying to avoid as many as possible. Tank debuff is like a big explosion. You see here, like I'm going to eat a stack and just run it out. Deals reduced damage based on distance here. But the big mechanic was the Threads of Life thing, where you kind of have to aim these daggers here. You see this green line. It's kind of hard to see them so far away, but there's basically this green line between like a starting point and a player. It's going to hit anyone between them, but you kind of have to make sure you aim it over one of these lines. Otherwise, it deals like a bunch of raid damage, which you want to avoid. There's also basically alternates between like a boss phase and intermission phase here, which you're going to see at full energy. You can fast forward to basically get 2 ads that pop up, one on either side. They've got a kick, but you're mostly just kind of nuking them down. Then split up, nuke them down, and then you go back to the boss here and see the lines kind of redraw into a new pattern when this intermission phase happens, and the boss is immune as well during this phase. I think this is my least favorite boss so far. It feels like it's missing something, at least on the heroic testing. It felt just a little bit lacking, and I don't believe it has any mythic mechanics in the journal as of yet. So maybe that gets fixed with a mythic mechanic. But this boss felt very, very, simple, especially for a wing end boss that it is, right? So there's not a lot to this fight. Like, I've explained the whole fight actually already. That's all there is to the fight. Kind of sit here and kind of slap the boss. There's some raid damage going out that kind of accelerates over the course of the fight. Similar to that Igira boss where you get a stacking buff every intermission that happens, right? So you want to kill the boss as quickly as possible, but that's kind of it. So it definitely feels like it's missing something currently, but potential to have that resolved before this boss actually goes live. Then we get to move into the Fire Wing here with Volcoross. So this is another potentially third or fourth boss of the raid. You could do this immediately after the second boss, Igira. And this one, obviously, giant worm here in the center of the room. Definitely giving me a little bit of Skolex vibes for tank debuster. It's kind of interesting here. Ooh, little voice crack. Okay. But basically, the auto attacks are going to stack up this like dot and damage taken increase from the Cataclysm Jaws here. And so basically how it works is you have one tank tanking the boss. Then when Cataclysm Jaws comes out, you taunt swap. So you taunt swap on the tank buster so that the tank with no stacks takes a tank buster that isn't damage amped whatsoever here. The one happens really early in the fight, so that one's not too big a deal. But basically, I'm just gonna like tank this boss until the next damage amp, and that's kind of you'll just swap on those big hits. And basically what's going to happen here is you're going to have these two raid soaks that pop up right on our position. I believe it always starts on the eastern edge if you look at the map here. But then these two soaks are going to continue to rotate around the room in opposite directions. So one's going counterclockwise, one's going clockwise here. And so it kind of potentially incentivizes you to split up your raid entirely after this initial phase here. And maybe, you're going to have two groups kind of rotating in opposite directions and meeting up at the end. It's the third boss, so I doubt it's going to have a super hard enrage. In the meantime, though, of course, you've got the tail coming down, slamming the platform. You've got fire puddles going out that are area denial. You've got these swirlies on individual players as well that you want to make sure you don't hit your friends with. I believe that actually changes on Mythic as well. Potentially need to like pass it around or something like that. We're going to see the soaks. Here they are. Big soaks in a second here. They slam down, knock you, and then, they are still area denial here, so you're going to lose space every time that happens. And I believe you'll see another one here in a second. Yeah, so then, like I said, it just continues to rotate around the room here. So we're going to get another set of soaks here. And so one's here and one's on the opposite side, right? So you definitely want to be on, a split group, or at least enough people to soak them. I believe there's like a minimum, maybe 4 or 5 players have to soak each or something like that. So you're going to be rotating around the room here. So pretty interesting. And eventually you'll meet up again on the opposite side over there. Honestly, it seems like a pretty cool boss. Love a little single target burn boss here. Always fun. Lots of damage going out. Pretty straightforward mechanically, but that kind of makes sense for a third boss. I think it's going to be a pretty good one. Just going to see how the actual tuning is. Is this going to be like a Taros situation where you actually go right to Enrage early on in the patch, but then it's pretty easy to meet it later in the patch? That's my hope. Always good to see those like damage checks, which are relevant early on, but maybe become less and less relevant later on, where it's like maybe you'll kill the boss and you still have like an extra debuff to go out before you end up out of space, right? So I think that would be cool to see. We'll have to see how the tuning on this boss goes, though. Then we have the wing end boss of the Fire Wing, Larodar. So this is the only boss that wasn't actually tested on Heroic yet. It was only tested on Normal. The Heroic test got delayed a bit, but basically, there's a bunch of fire throughout the room. A bunch of abilities are going to make fire. There's a bunch of ads as well that will make fire. And basically, if you kill these ads, it like powers up this thing in the middle of the room here, and you can use that, interact with it, like the Seed of Life or something like that, and that will allow you to clear some of the fire. There you see like the boss charge makes a bunch of fire, and then we have the Trents healing up the Seed of Life, and people can use the Seed of Life here to, empower themselves and clear themselves. So a bunch of ads on this boss fight. The boss also has 2 phases, basically. He transitions, and the last phase is kind of like you want to kill the boss before you actually run out of space here. So fast forwarding through that, you got the little intermission. Oh, you got these trees you can like hide in for the fire. More ads. Here's the intermission. Lots of big damage there. And then you basically now have like a frontal attack. You've got a Void Seeker. Like we haven't really used the Seed of Life much here. I'm not sure if it was bugged or what, potentially why the boss hadn't been tested, but that's the idea, is you'd use it to clear this fire. But you see we're running out of space quick here, so you kind of got to kill the boss before you run out of space. Then constantly will have ads running in this phase too. The tank debuff is basically like a full healing reduction. You need to leech your health back by standing on allies, which is kind of cool. Overall, I think this boss definitely has some potential for sure. We'll have to see how the heroic and the mythic options turn out, but I like this boss a lot better than Nymue personally. And again, it's kind of in the like Rashok slash Forgotten Experiments slot in the raid, so it's a wing end boss here. This guy just dropped here as well, of course. Then we get to the big guns here. We got Smolderon. This is gonna be a banger of a fight. So this is like not Neltharion like before Neltharion. Like we discussed before, we moved Megamirax to be the second boss, so I guess this would technically be in the Zaskarn slot, but this is a banger of a boss fight. Very, very big Sludge Fist vibes. Because, you know, basically there's going to be 4 boss phases and there's 4 damage amp phases. So this tank soak goes out. When you soak this, you'll get a debuff on you, a permanent debuff basically. There's 2 of these per phase. And if you have that debuff going into the intermission phase, you basically pop out 5 orbs that give you a 100% damage amp for that phase, and you just get to go to town on the boss. So pretty cool there, and you're basically just rotating around the room, you know, losing space as you rotate around the room from these fire puddles. You know, you shoot out tornadoes. On Mythic, there's like orbs going out. And in the actual intermission phase itself, you have to like dodge these like rings going out from the boss, which is kind of cool. So I'm super hyped about this fight. This fight looks super, super cool. So maybe it's gonna compete again with like a Zaskarn competing, I guess, where what boss would that be? I guess there's not really a comparable boss because there's no boss before Broodkeeper in the actual first raid, Vault Incarnates, right? So I guess this would kind of be in the Anduin slot if you look at Sepulchre of the first ones. So potentially going to be a really, really sick boss. This is what the intermission phase looks like. Basically, you're going to shoot out. I have the debuff, right? So I'll get knocked back. I'm going to shoot out these orbs. I soak them. I get 5 stacks of a damage amp here. You can only see your own orbs, so don't need to worry about, oh, you got to stack the orbs on the DPS players. Everyone who's soaked gets their own 5 orbs that only they can see. And then these rings, the World in Flames from Ragnaros mechanic, are going to start, you know, doing a pattern around the boss that you just kind of avoid. And this repeats basically 4 times until the room basically fills up with these rings after the 4th damage amp phase. And you just need to kill the boss before he kills you with this fire. So really, really cool boss. Again, big Sludge Fist vibes from this guy. So hopefully it has the same tuning as Sludge Fist, because that fight was super sick. That was a really, really good fight. So big hopes for this one, of course, especially because it's so late in the raid. It has the ability to be, you know, one of the harder bosses too. So I'm really, really excited to see how this boss shapes up. And that brings us to the final boss that was actually tested, which is the second last boss, Tindral Sageswift. And this is the dragon riding boss, right? So as much as people were worried about, you know, the gimmicky bosses, I know, you know, there was like Terragru back in Sanctum that had to do with the anima powers. And of course we saw dragon riding. So, you know, there's going to be a dragon riding boss. This one is really, really good, actually. I'm also pretty excited with this. So the end bosses so far in this raid are looking really, really cool. So you got this like you know, this root mechanic in the first, in all the phases actually, that are kind of like the Broodkeeper roots, where you can break them with various freeing effects, or you could kill them to get them out. These aren't magic debuffs like those ones, so you can't dispel them, but you can kill them, and these kind of overlap with other abilities, so you are kind of incentivized to kill these pretty quickly. The boss goes through 3 phases here. This is the Boomkin phase. In the very first platform, you can see it's a little laggy on PTR. You know, it's got all this big fire and sun stuff to avoid. There's arcane stuff as well that go out. You dragon ride to a platform, then it enters the tree phase, where there's like a big tranquility. You gotta like soak seeds on the ground, that kind of stuff. Then he flies again to his 3rd platform, and that's where you kill the boss, and that's where the boss kind of does both Boomkin and tree abilities. So you get this like big, nice phase at the end that has like all the hard abilities with the hard overlaps and that kind of stuff here. That's pretty cool. Honestly, let's fast forward a little bit. See that what the dragon riding phase looks like. Basically, he turns into an owl. He shoots out a bunch of like feathers. And then you press the extra action button, you get a buff here, and that lets you dragon ride. I think I didn't have my dragon riding mount bound. Yeah, I had to go into my mount log here, so have it bound. and then you're gonna fly. And you get these green orbs, and anyone touching this green orb gives the raid a stack of this damage amp here, and then it turns these into like speed boosts. So you do actually always want to aim for them because it gives you this extra speed boost to get to the platform quickly. I believe it's capped at 10 stacks, so this is our full damage amp here, and then the next phase is 15, I think. But then the boss just has a shield and starts casting Supernova, so you want to get here with your damage amp, break the shield, and then interrupt this before he casts it, otherwise you die. And then, you know, you get the new phase here, which is, again, the tree phase. You get this is pulsing damage, and it summons all these seeds that you have to touch to soak before, you know, they explode or something like that. I don't actually remember exactly what they do, but you know, that's kind of the tree stuff here. Oh, the tank mechanic too is kind of cool. These mushrooms come out like this. They do a big hit, and it's a 3-second debuff, but they're staggered by 2 seconds. So basically there's 4 mushrooms, and you want one tank to soak the first and the third, and the other tank to soak the second and the fourth. And this changes on Mythic because there's like a fire and a poison mushroom, so it becomes a little bit more interesting. So that's kind of an interesting little thing tanks deal with outside of the actual tank debuff itself. So that's kind of cool. But overall, I actually am pleasantly surprised by this. This fight is potentially going to be the best penultimate boss of the expansion so far, right? I guess that's comparing against Neltharion in Aberrus and Broodkeeper in Vault of the Incarnates, but this one is looking really, really good. So again, the later bosses in this raid are looking exceptionally good. I'm very, very excited for them. Here's the second dragon riding phase here. This one's a little bit more complicated too. I think the orbs in this phase that you need to avoid are like moving and stuff, and there's like a lot more verticality to it. So yeah, overall I'm excited for this boss, excited for Smolderon. Some of the early bosses look pretty decent too, so I think this raid is going to be a pretty solid one for sure. But I would love to hear what you guys think down in the comments below. How are you guys feeling about the raid? What bosses are you most and least looking forward to? Let me know. Also, a reminder again, I stream all the raid and even Mythic Plus testing over on my Twitch channel at Tactics. Link in the description below if you want to check it out and, you know, stop by, say hi, see how everything in Season 3 is looking. Be sure to you know, click on that link and come say hi. Of course, I do have to give a big thank you to all of my Patreon members for their support. It really does mean a lot to me, and I will see everyone in my next video.